Here we go. As I said, my name is Pete Grimm. I run the strategy and operations practice here at Fahrenheit Advisors. I also mentioned that I spent the first part of my career in national security. I was in the military for a few years, and then worked at one of the large government agencies doing counterterrorism work, spent a lot of time in the Middle East in that role. Left the government in 2008 and went to work at Deloitte in the strategy practice there. So I worked with mostly Fortune 500s across a variety of industries, including manufacturing and logistics, distribution, a little bit of healthcare and technology as well. I then ran a small firm, a small boutique consulting firm called Cypher for about 6 years before joining Fahrenheit a few years ago. So that's a little bit about me. Let's go ahead and dive into what we want to talk about today. So I spend a lot of my time talking about strategy and how, helping companies place bets about the future, which is fundamentally what strategy is about. And we've all heard kind of the cliche phrase from, it's always attributed to Wayne Gretzky, but I think it was actually his dad who said it, skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where it has been, right? So we want to understand what the future environment that we're likely to be in looks like so that we can plan sort of backward from that to help us achieve our objectives. That's getting harder and harder to do, largely because the pace of change is moving so quickly now and continuing to accelerate. This chart, frankly, is old now, but I still think it's a good representation of just how quickly things are changing. So what this shows us is the penetration rate, essentially, of various consumer technologies over really kind of the 20th century, a little bit into the 21st century. And if you see kind of from the bottom left-hand part of the screen, right behind where my head is, you can see the phone, and it goes up across, 1900 or so. It's introduced a little bit before then, and by 1956, 58, somewhere in there, had about 90% or 91% penetration of US households. So it took a good 50 or 60 years for that penetration to happen. Whereas on the other side of this chart, when you look at the red line that's almost vertical there, that's the iPhone in 2008. And so the adoption rate of these new technologies continues to increase. And now with AI, we're seeing, frankly, an unprecedented investment cycle in some of these new technologies. You can see there over the course of the last 150 years or so, 200 years, there have been a number of these cycles around the railroads, obviously, in this country. Cars were a big one in terms of the investment in infrastructure and all the things associated with those technologies. And then you see on the right-hand side, AI, both data centers and some of the tools themselves. Just extraordinary amounts of investment going into this because the players in that space recognize that it's a race and they want to be the first movers. So there's some of this is projections, right? We're only in 2026 and this chart goes to 2030, but those are the projections at the moment in terms of how much exactly is going to be spent as a percentage of our GDP. You can see AI there, we add those two blue and purple lines together, you're talking about over 10% of GDP being spent on these two technologies, which is pretty remarkable. So we're seeing things change, very rapidly. We're seeing the pace of that change continue to accelerate. So getting insights into what that future, where the puck is going to be, is getting harder and harder to do. And we're having to do it more and more frequently. So I want to talk first, before we dive into how we can do this with respect to disruptive changes in our industries, I want to talk a little bit about how we think. So in any strategy problem, it's fundamentally a problem-solving exercise, right? We're dealing with uncertainty. We have incomplete data, same as I had in the intelligence community. We never had a complete set of facts with 100% certainty. And that's the case in strategy. We never know with certainty what the future is going to look like. So we want to get through the course of this problem-solving journey from the bottom left-hand corner of this chart, where in a place we'll call complexity, lots of moving pieces, lots of variables. We don't necessarily understand how they relate to one another. We want to get up to the top right-hand corner of conviction. That's our goal. So we want to get from complexity to conviction. You'll notice that dashed line through the middle of the chart that kind of bifurcates it, the horizontal line there. When we talk about anything below that line, we're going to be talking about inputs to our process. So we're gathering data, we're reading reports, we're collecting information from the field, we're doing competitive intel, whatever it might be, we're collecting information in the bottom half of this graph. Top half of this graph, conversely, will be the output. So we're providing our recommendation, or we're making our decision, or developing our presentation for the board, or whatever it might be. So fundamentally, there's kind of four ways we can take this journey. The first one is the simplest, and we've referred to it as the expert route. So if you've ever been through, in a large company, if you've ever been through a big systems transformation, or we're implementing a new CRM or a new ERP system or something like that, you might bring in a consultant from outside who's done that very transition lots of times before and are experts in it, hopefully. And they more or less know what conviction looks like when they undertake one of these projects. So the result is we get a fairly linear line from complexity to conviction because we know what the answer is when we start. We just have to get there. So you might have some setbacks and little stage gates and those sorts of things that you have to navigate, but fairly linear path. So we have a work plan, again, very common when you think about kind of how IT consultants would work. Now, the second route we can take is the one that we're sort of all taught to take in grammar school up through, high school and into most of our post-secondary education, particularly if you went to a liberal arts school or you were trained, went to law school or something like that. This is very, very common. If you go back to kind of second grade, the teacher might have told you, or you might have been chastised, you really need to read the whole book before you can write a book report about it. In other words, you need to collect all the data there is before we can really think about what it means and how to make a decision about it. And this is kind of how we're taught to think, where it's the analytical route. So we're essentially going to collect data until we're certain in the bottom right-hand corner that we kind of have all the data. We have certainty. So therefore, hopefully we get to a place where we go, aha, we have the answer. We have all the data, so therefore we can find the answer in a pretty straightforward fashion. That's the analytical route. Very common when you think about professions that think this way, and apologies to any lawyers or accountants who are on the call today, but professions that have historically been paid by the hour, where value is a function of the time that somebody spends on a task, this path works just fine. It sort of doesn't matter how many person hours it takes us to collect all the depositions or all of the pieces of evidence or all of the things we want to look at before we form an argument, if we're attorneys, because we're being compensated for all that time that we're spending collecting that data. Now, there is a third route that's sort of the polar opposite of this, and that we'll call the creative route. So instead of collecting data, we're only going to collect just a little bit of data up front in this process, and then we're going to go straight up to the other corner called clarity. And we do that by structuring these really complicated problems with options. So if you think about a creative profession, maybe an architect or an advertising firm, you go to them with a very, very complicated problem. I'd like you to design me a house, for instance. They're going to collect a little bit of data about how big does the house need to be, where is it going to be located, tell me a little bit about your sort of lifestyle and that sort of thing. And then pretty soon thereafter, they're going to come back to you with options, with concepts, and they'll say, here are three ideas. Which one of these kind of feels right to you? You might have a very traditional one, a little bit more modern option. Maybe there's a personal style of that particular architect. And from there, we're essentially living in the outputs. We're up here in the outputs very quickly in the creative process. And the magic of creativity, in my opinion, really is in this process right here. How do you take a sort of infinitely complex problem and put some structure around it with options? Now, for strategists, for us thinking about disruption and what that could mean for our business and what forms it might be likely to take, how we could see it coming. Neither one of these is particularly well suited for that. Number one, we don't have necessarily the time or the resources in many cases, or the capability, frankly, with as much data as out there today, to collect all of the data. It's just not a It's not generally going to be the best option to try and collect all of the data to inform a strategic decision about something like disruption because it'll take too long, it'll cost too much, and frankly, there's just too much data to make sense of in many cases. We also can't sort of rely purely on our gut feel or our creative instincts here because there's pretty high stakes in most cases. We've got, employees that we need to think about, stakeholders, shareholders, that we need to convince, obviously, that this is the right path. So there is a fourth option here, and we'll call this the strategic route. And really what it is a blend of the creative route and the analytical route. So we're going to start by structuring this really complicated problem with some options, and we'll use our experience and expertise to help us do that. Some of that we're going to hopefully build today. But then we need to go back down into the data, into the inputs to validate those options or determine which of those options might be the best one for our particular business. So that's what we're going to do today. This is really how I was taught to think in the intelligence community. And candidly, the intelligence community borrowed, learned from a lot of the thinking that had gone into how doctors are taught to think. So when you think about when you go to the doctor, they're going to collect a little bit of data up front, right? A little bit of inputs. They'll take your vital signs and your medical history and your family history and those sorts of things, a little bit of data. And how you're presenting to them, what your symptoms are, do you have a fever, that sort of thing. And they'll use that little bit of data to structure a super complicated problem into options. And they'll say, based on the symptoms that you're displaying and your vital signs and so on and so forth, you likely have one of these 3, 4, or 5 conditions. But then they're going to go dive back into the data in a very targeted way. They're not going to run every test they possibly could. They're not going to run all of the x-rays and CAT scans and MRIs and blood tests and all the other things that they have at their disposal. They're going to be very targeted in what data they go collect based on the options that they've identified. And so we want to be the same. We want to be efficient in terms of the research that we actually need to do to inform these decisions. So that's what I want us to think about today. And if you notice the strategic path where we sort of structure this problem with options and then dive back down into the inputs, that is really how our disruption proofing process is built. So first we need to understand, we need to have the background and the experience and expertise to be able to do that structuring with options like a doctor would, so that we can structure a very complicated problem with options. Then we'll dive back down into the data to help prioritize some of the options available to us. So that's kind of how this thing is built. I'm not going to expect you to read all the words on this slide, but fundamentally, we're going to start with understanding how disruption works. We're going to go to med school for at least the next 20 minutes or so, and talk about how disruption works and the different, what I call pathologies of disruption that we've seen in different industries and what the patterns are that you can spot there. We'll then think about where our business might be vulnerable to these different types of disruptions within our industry. So we refer to that as vulnerability analysis. And then we'll go down into the data and start to collect very targeted information and data and insights to help us determine which of the options we identified as the best. So we're going to spend most of our time today in number 1 and number 2, but just give you a little bit of context in terms of the broader process. What we're going to talk about today is just the start, but it's really important groundwork. So let's talk a little bit about the pathologies of disruption and what I mean by that. So why do I call them pathologies? So there are, as I said, patterns that are identifiable that having looked at, many case studies of different industries that have been pretty fundamentally disrupted over the last 50 years or so, there are patterns that emerge, and there are some theories that have been built around different types of disruption. And we're going to talk about really 2 of the 3 main categories today. We're going to talk about disruptive innovation. We're going to talk about the 9 patterns. The last one on this slide, Amy Webb's 11 sources of disruption, is a great one. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get today, but I do encourage you to check out her thinking as well. But really, the point here is we want to think like doctors. So we're going to understand the pathology and the patterns and the signs that we'd be looking for So then we can help ourselves structure this really complicated problem with some options. So let's look at an example of one type of disruption.
Hi, I'm Mike, founder of DollarShaveClub.com. What is DollarShaveClub.com? Well, for $1 a month, we send high-quality razors right to your door. Yeah, $1. Are the blades any good? No. Our blades are f***ing great. Each razor has stainless steel blades, an aloe vera lubricating strip, and a pivot head. It's so gentle a toddler could use it. And do you like spending $20 a month on brand name razors? 19 go to Roger Federer. I'm good at tennis. And do you think your razor needs a vibrating handle, a flashlight, a back scratcher, and 10 blades? Your handsome-ass grandfather had 1 blade and polio. Looking good, pop up! Stop paying for shave tech you don't need. And stop forgetting to buy your blades every month. Alejandro and I are going to ship them right to you. We're not just selling razors, we're also making new jobs. Alejandro, what were you doing last month?
Not working.
What are you doing now?
Working.
I'm no Vanderbilt, but this train makes hay. So stop forgetting to buy your blades every month and start deciding where you're going to stack all those dollar bills I'm saving you. We are DollarShaveClub.com, and the party is on.
All right. I love that video. Probably costs a couple $100 to make that video. That came out in 2011, went viral. And what you see on the screen here is sort of the results of this very particular type of disruption. So what we're looking at here is, let's start with the orange line, which is Dollar Shave Club's valuation over the 5 years right after that video came out. So they raised a seed round in 2012 for less than $1 million. They valued the company at $6 million. 4 years later, really, in 2016, they sold to Unilever for $1 billion. So what explains that? Well, if you look at the blue line there, that is Procter Gamble's men's grooming segment net sales. And when you look at that same period of time, they shaved, no pun intended, about $1.5 billion off the top line of that business. A large portion of that was attributable to Dollar Shave Club and the market share that they took. So how did this happen? Well, there is a particular theory that explains how this happens, developed by a gentleman named Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School, very famous. If you haven't read his stuff, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. But one of his maybe most famous theories is the theory of disruptive innovation. And Dollar Shave Club is a perfect example of disruptive innovation, as Christensen would frame it. So what is disruptive innovation? So fundamentally, if we look at the chart on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see kind of 2 red lines. So that middle red line, the top red line, I guess I should say, represents, in this case, Procter Gamble, okay? And the bottom red line will represent Dollar Shave Club. So the blue lines then represent the different segments of the men's grooming market, with the low end of the market obviously at the bottom, those customers that are potentially least profitable, the least demanding. They just sort of want a basic product that'll do the job. Whereas the top blue line represents the high end of the market. So the most demanding customers, the customers who are most willing to pay for the 5 blades and the vibrating head and the flashlight and all the other shave tech. The Dollar Shave Club was telling us we don't need. So if you're Procter & Gamble and you're running the men's grooming segment, or you're running the Gillette brands or any of those products, you spend a lot of your time trying to think about how to get into that most profitable high-end segment of the market. And that drives a lot of the iterative, incremental innovations that you see with now we have 3 blades, now we have 4 blades, now we have 5 blades, and it vibrates, and we have the flashlight. Those are all attempts to get up into that highest end segment of the market. And sometimes what happens when companies do that is they start to neglect not just the low end of the market, but parts of the mainstream, who now are wondering why they're paying, just exorbitant prices for these razor blades, and starting to wonder if there might be alternatives. And so enter a company like Dollar Shave Club, again, the bottom red line, who's going to start by targeting that low end of the market, targeting those overserved customers who don't need 5 blades, who don't need the vibrating head, don't want to pay for all of that stuff. They just want a clean shave. So that was fundamentally Dollar Shave Club's strategy. And again, a perfect example of Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation. So that's one type of innovation, I beg your pardon, of disruption that we talk a lot about. And it's important to know kind of what the characteristics of that are and how to spot it. But it's certainly not the only one. Well, first, before we move on to that, let's talk a little bit about electric vehicles. One of the things when you talk about disruption that you will start to notice is there's a problem with just the definition of terms. Disruption is a hugely broad word that can mean lots of different things to different people. And when Clay Christensen talked about disruption, he meant a very specific phenomenon, this disruptive innovation. So when you think about a company like Tesla, you might say, well, obviously that's a disruptor, right? It really fundamentally changed the auto industry. Well, Christensen rather said, well, hold on, that's not what I was talking about. He would have called them a sustaining innovation, electric vehicles, that is. Clayton Christensen would have said he did in fact say, they're a sustaining innovation as opposed to a disruptor. In other words, that's not what I'm talking about, guys. They didn't enter the lower end of the market and work up from the bottom. And it was actually quite the opposite when you think about it. So very particular type of disruption that Christensen was talking about. Now, how about Aldi and Lidl? If we stay within the frame of how Christensen thinks about the world and thinks about disruption, I would tell you, Pete Grimm would tell you that Aldi and Lidl very much are disruptors and are following the disruptive innovation playbook. They certainly are targeting overserved customers of the traditional grocery chains. They're offering lower performance at a lower price, trying to create a new market, targeting customers who couldn't use or afford the existing product. It ticks a lot of the boxes that Christensen would lay out to say, hey, this is actually disruptive. Now, it's a little counterintuitive, right? And that's what I mean why the terminology can be so important here. So there's another framework that I want to talk to you guys about that I find is really helpful, and that's the 9 patterns of disruption. Now, I'm going to go through this very quickly today just due to time constraints, but essentially, some of my former colleagues at Deloitte did a study a few years back where they looked at 150 or so case studies of industries that had been well and truly disrupted, fundamentally changed. The value creation paths are now different in a lot of these industries. And they identified 9 patterns that essentially all these case studies, you could see one or more of these patterns at work. So I find this really helpful as we think about ways that our own industry could be changing over time. More likely than not, it's going to follow one of these patterns. Okay. And so these 9 patterns, they broke into 2 kind of broad categories you can see on the right-hand and the left-hand side of the slide. The left-hand side, the first 5 patterns that Deloitte talked about in this report really have to do with network effects. So very much technology enabled with the advent of the cloud and the reduction in cost over time of broadband access and speed and latency and all those types of factors enabled pretty fundamentally new business models that upended some industries. The first one being expanding marketplace reach. So this pattern is really, when you think about it, fundamentally what Amazon did, what Etsy did, where you're identifying that there's a very fragmented set of buyers and sellers that are not currently connected and using technology to connect them in new and innovative ways. Unlocking adjacent assets, you could think about Uber or Airbnb. There are lots of examples of this now, not just in sort of the consumer world, but in the industrial world as well, where you essentially have a pretty capital-intensive asset, like a personally owned car or a house, a vacation home or something like that. Very capital-intensive and often very underutilized. So how do we unlock that excess capacity in that capital asset? That's really what Uber and Airbnb have done. Third one is turning products into platforms. So if you think about The App Store is obviously a great example of this, and the ecosystem that many of these companies like Apple and other tech companies have spent a lot of time trying to build platforms on which others from outside their organization can build and create value, and then monetizing pieces of other people's value creation. The fourth one is connecting peers in new ways. You could think about Discord. You could think about a whole variety of things. GitHub is probably the most famous of these. For those of you who are not coders, I am not a coder either. But anybody who knows anything about coding will know what GitHub is. And it's fundamentally kind of a repository for open source code, and also allows developers and engineers to communicate and kind of collectively solve problems together. The fifth one that they talked about is distributing product development. Perhaps the best, there are lots of examples of this one too. Perhaps the easiest to intuitively understand is Wikipedia. And so if you think about 20 years ago, those of you who are old enough to remember the old Encyclopedia Britannicas, the bricks or the set of bricks that would sit on the shelf until you had a question. Well, there were people who wrote those big volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica. It was a centralized team of analysts who wrote each article and researched everything. Wikipedia said, we're going to distribute the development of this product to the crowd. So this is really about crowdsourcing, right? So we're going to crowdsource the development of this knowledge and centralize it into one place. So that's kind of the network effect set. Other side of the equation is really about the value price equation and innovative ways that people have leveraged, in some cases, technology, in some cases, understanding value chains and how they can be perhaps shortened to transform the price of a particular unit of value. So if you think about unbundling products and services, which is the first pattern in this category, think about Netflix as a good example, or just Netflix as an avatar for the streaming revolution over the last, say, 10, 15 years. If you think about the traditional cable bundle that many of us would have paid a bill for many years, you would have your cable and your internet and your phone sort of all wrapped into one literal bundle. What streaming was really about was unbundling those bundles. So can we find segments of the market that really particularly value one aspect of that bundle, but don't particularly care about the others? Maybe they'll pay more for that one particular aspect of the traditional bundle, that being the content piece in the streaming case. So that's the first one. Second one on this side is shortening the value chain. This might be the one, this and the next one might be the two patterns that I see the most frequently, particularly given my clientele today, which is a lot of manufacturers and logistics companies, construction companies, those types of things. In the industrial space, these are the two we're going to spend the most time talking about typically. So we're going to talk in detail about those in a little bit, but I'll come back to them. And then the last one on this side is kind of the opposite of number 6. So it's converging multiple products into one in a way that creates something greater than the sum of its parts, which is, arguably the whole trick behind the iPhone was the fact that if you can put all these different products into one easy to use device, the value you can get out of the device is greater than all the different legacy pieces that have been converged. So those are the patterns. Again, there's a lot more to them, but this is the crux of what I mean when I say going to med school and understanding the pathologies that we're looking for in our own industries. This is really a crucial piece of that. So let's talk about shortening the value chain. So what does that mean? In plain terms, every industry has a value chain of some sort. You might say a company is very, very well vertically integrated if they're playing in multiple stages of that value chain, whether it's raw materials to manufacturing to distribution to retail to it's different across different industries. But understanding what that value chain is and where we are currently playing in it can be really helpful to understand where we might see disruption in that value chain. A lot of the key disruptions that again, I've spent a lot of time working on and thinking about have to do with this pattern. And I'll give you one example here. Let's talk about this one. So many of you might be familiar with Mark Cuban, Dallas Mavericks owner. He's been a billionaire since the dot-com rush in the early 2000s. He's been involved with lots of different companies. He has a startup at the moment that's very closely identified with him and his kind of personal brand. And it's targeting the what is today a very complex value chain in the pharmaceutical space and in the US healthcare market. So essentially, what they are trying to do is to remove a middleman out of that value chain. And I'll show you some more specifics about that here in just a moment. But essentially, the whole core value proposition of this company is that they're going to actually manufacture generic drugs to start. They're now increasingly moving into the branded space, but really the focus was on the generic drug space. And they said, we're going to manufacture these generic drugs, and we're going to have, total transparency about how much it costs us to manufacture these drugs. And then we're going to mark them up at a fixed 15% margin. And that's how we're going to price things. Pretty radical departure from how it works today. So let me show you how roughly, again, very high level, how the pharmaceutical value chain in the US works today. So we've all probably been a patient at some point, almost, I think, by definition. We know what that role looks like. Many of us, if we're not on one of the sort of state or federal programs, are receiving healthcare benefits from our employers, generally in the US. So the employer is providing us benefits. The employers are then dealing generally with a broker who is dealing with the payers, the insurance companies, who are actually going to be on the hook to pay for some or most of these costs. So we've got kind of three sets of stakeholders. Now we've got the fourth, which is the actual doctor, the healthcare provider, who's going to diagnose us using a very similar process to that which we're trying to use today, and often prescribe medications to the patient, who then needs to submit them in many cases to the pharmacy benefit manager, who works generally with the payers. These are the companies that on your pharmacy benefits are going to control the formulary. So which drugs are covered and how much they cost. And one of the key, there's a couple key pain points here in the current construct that I think Cost Plus Drugs is targeting. Number one is this pre-authorization loop. I'm not actually sure what the most recent statistics are, but I can tell my wife is in healthcare. Doctors, nurse practitioners, healthcare providers, nurses spend an incredible amount of time dealing with pharmacy benefit managers around pre-authorizations that then get denied and there have to be appealed, and there's back and forth. Lots of time and energy goes into that process before the patient can even get the medication they need. Now, in the current structure for generic drugs specifically, you have these manufacturers, just a sample of some of them, who are then negotiating the prices for these generic drugs with the pharmacy benefit manager. Now, one of the big complaints that you hear about the way our system works is that these are not disclosed. Nobody really knows how much the manufacturer is charging the pharmacy benefit manager, and then what the margin is that PBM is making on a given drug. So that's kind of the crux of Cost Plus Drugs, right? So the vision for them, it's an open question as to whether or not they'll succeed, I would say, at this stage. But the vision is essentially to remove the pharmacy benefit managers from this equation. So they're going to be, in their vision, the manufacturer of these generic drugs and the benefit manager, with the differentiator that those drug prices will be 100% transparent based on that sort of fixed fee markup structure. So that's a really good example of at least, somebody trying to pursue a disruptive pattern around shortening the value chain. So when we think about industries where we want to be particularly sensitive to this, it's those with the most complicated value chains, where you have multiple layers of distribution or entities touching a product or precursors or raw materials or any piece of that process before it gets to the end user. That's generally a good place to look for new and innovative ways to shorten that value chain. Okay, so that's one of the key patterns. Now, now that we kind of understand how disruption works, and I would say we've got a better idea now than we did 15, 20 minutes ago, although not complete, just again based on the limitations of time today. But once we do have a good understanding of how disruption actually happens, how do we assess our exposure to it, right? So this process again that I call vulnerability analysis. And there's really kind of 4 or 5 key tools that I find most helpful to do this vulnerability analysis. And they're not anything new or special. These are some of the fundamental kind of strategic theories that have been developed over the years that I find most helpful when we're thinking about trying to identify those core assets, those core differentiators, those core competitive advantages that exist for us today, have made us successful to date, that we want to make sure are preserved over time, or that if there is going to be a disruptive change that's going to alter one of those fundamental value creation mechanisms, we have time to respond to it and hopefully capitalize on it. So these are the 3. I'm just going to walk through a couple of them with you today at a very high level, just to kind of give you a sense of how they work. So differentiation, pretty rudimentary, when you think about it in theoretical terms. So what is it that makes you different from your competitors? This comes from Michael Porter's thinking largely, but really, this is more complicated than it sounds. And I've asked lots and lots of companies this question, tell me 3 things that makes your company different from all the other competitors. And most companies will tell me, at least in the first couple answers, our people. We have the best people, which represents to me kind of a fundamental misunderstanding about what a differentiator is. It's something that nobody else can claim, that nobody else can deliver on. That can't be the case if everybody in your industry is telling me they have the best people, right? It just that doesn't add up. So it requires often some critical analysis and some critical thinking to kind of peel back what I call the marketing speak, that all of us tell the world about why we're so great. We tell each other within our organizations what makes us so great. You need to be a little bit more critical in your thinking about it than just accepting sort of what's on the website in terms of what makes us different. Often requires some voice of customer work to understand how you're perceived, or what your perceived differentiators are in the market. As we know, customers' perception is reality. So that's a crucial piece of this. So we start there generally, talking about what makes us different, what are our true differentiators. Then often I like to use the value disciplines. So very quickly here, this theory says that in every industry, every company competing in that industry competes along 3 axes. So who's got the best product, who can sell it profitably at the lowest price, which is really what operational excellence is about, and then who has the best customer intimacy. And by that, they mean who knows their customers best, who understands the customer's business the best, who can identify problems or pain points that their customers are going to have, maybe even before the customers see them. That's customer intimacy. So in order to be successful, the theory holds that we need to be the best amongst all the competitors on at least one of these axes, and we have to be competitive on the other 2. So this is a great little exercise you can do with your team. Put yourself on these axes. You're going to be somewhere between the orange and the blue lines, with the best in class today being on this blue circle, the worst in class today potentially being below this orange circle representing kind of minimum competitiveness or table stakes, blue representing the current best in class, and the green representing the fact that all of these rings are constantly expanding. People are constantly innovating. They're working on efficiencies to drive prices down. So these rings are always expanding, and we need to consistently be on that blue ring on at least one of these axes. That fundamental set of insights can actually tell you a lot about how your company competes and how we should be thinking about our advantages when it comes to protecting them against disruption. So I love this little tool. The next one that I use quite often is called the happy line. This comes out of the blue ocean strategy thinking from Chan Kim. Really what this is about is understanding what your customers value. So for each segment of customers that you serve, they will have a set of decision factors, value drivers, you can call them different things. But what are the factors that go into their decision to choose you or to choose a competitor? And then of those factors, which are most important to their decision-making process? And so basically we need to do some research to understand that if we don't already have some data around that. But then we'll lay out the value drivers sort of in ascending order of importance as we go to the right on that little chart. And you'll generally see that there'll be one or two, maybe three, that are considerably more important than all the others. And all the others will tend to be fairly equal. So we might see price in some segments. We might see price way up at the top on the very top of this light green line. We might see product quality somewhere in here. We might see delivery time or lead time. It can be a whole variety of things depending on the industry. But generally, there's going to be three of them that are two or three that are more important than the others, and then everything else will be more or less equal. It's a good way to tell which ones are sort of table stakes. So you need to be at least this good, at least minimally competitive along each of these, but this is where you're actually going to win the business over here. Okay. Another great, fairly quick, not a huge lift to do this exercise with the team. And again, can give you some really good insights about how it is that you create value today. Okay, let's talk a little bit about AI, and then I've got a couple last points, and then we'll see if there's any Q&A. So I just want to highlight really quickly a great article that I would refer all of you to. Obviously, AI is a huge component of any discussion about disruption today. It's been core to the discussions I've been having with my clients for certainly the last 3 years, but I would say we've been talking about it for the last decade in the context of these projects. Very good article that was in the Harvard Business Review a little over a year ago now. But I find it a really helpful kind of framework to think about the impacts AI could have. Obviously, we want to have that context of the 9 patterns, but how can AI potentially enable new and innovative ways of disrupting industries that again, I do think will mostly follow those 9 patterns. And these guys identified 6 of them. So the first one is grains through granularity. And what they mean there is imagine a business where you have AI managing essentially all of the levers that drive your EBITDA or drive the business's EBITDA or performance, whatever metric you want to look at, automatically. So they're automatically, everything is just in time in the supply chain. Everything is priced very precisely relative to demand. Everything is done automatically. That's what they mean gains through granularity, okay, in a future world. The second one is the reshaped partner ecosystem. This is more some commentary about just the different things that we need to think about as we enter into the AI age. It's often going to involve partners, right? AI might not be our core competency and core to how we create value for customers. So we may be engaging with partners where, that relationship with those partners is going to be a lot tighter and a lot more in depth than we might be used to. And we might be linked to those partners in ways that we hadn't anticipated. So there's a set of considerations there. The risk picture is obviously quite different. Great thinking in this article about some of those risks and how to deal with it and the evolution of regulation and what that might look like. 4 and 5 here are the keys, though, when we think about it in the context of disruption. So there are going to be industries in which there are radical cost transformations. Some things are just simply going to cost a lot less than they used to. Certainly in some of the knowledge-based industries like my own, for instance, in consulting. There are certain processes now, whether it's market research or competitive analysis or a variety of different things, making PowerPoint decks that just cost a lot less than they used to. Most of my career, I had a team of 10 or 15 very, very bright, brand new MBAs that would handle a lot of that grunt work and do the market research and the competitive analysis and put together the PowerPoint decks and the reports and so forth. I candidly don't really need that team anymore to do a lot of that same work at a very high level using some of these AI tools. So there's going to be a lot of those changes. So being able to spot where those cost transformations are likely to come first and in what order is going to be really important to understanding how disruption might play out. The number 5 there is the value proposition redefinition. So this is, AI has fundamentally changed the way that we have historically created value for our customers, for our stakeholders. And now we have to really, at a very basic level, rethink our business model. Those are the 2 we talk probably the most about when we're thinking about disruption. The last one, obviously, is obsolescence. And there will, frankly, just be some things that become obsolete. We could argue for hours about what that is and how long it's going to take and this, that, and the other. It could be next year, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 20. I'm not here to take a stand on any of that. But I think it's safe to say that there are certain processes, certain tasks, certain maybe even business models that will become obsolete or slowly becoming obsolete due to the rise of AI. Okay, so I'm not going to walk you through the detail here because we're getting a little short on time. Let me just share with you a quick example from real life. This case study, one of my clients who I do have some permission to talk about at Sherwin-Williams. I've worked with them for well over a decade. And our work has focused around how their industry is likely to change over time, given some of these disruptive forces that we talked about earlier. So I wanted to share with you kind of a quick insight, but a very fundamental insight that has come out of some of this work. Now, this is a public slide. This came right out of their investor relations deck most recently. And this really communicates from Sherwin-Williams' perspective how they create value, right? It's all these things lead to value creation on the right-hand side of the slide. And they talk about, the controlled distribution model. They're very highly vertically integrated. They manufacture the paint, they distribute the paint, they own the retail stores. So they're pretty vertically integrated when you think about that value chain. Very heavily invested in brick and mortar and continuing to invest in bricks and mortar at a surprisingly rapid clip, given most of the trends that we see out there today related to brick and mortar. So I wanted to highlight two of these kind of core unique assets, is what Sherwin refers to them, and they both have to do with that vertical integration. So they own a lot of the supply chain for their products and they control distribution. And that's been a really fundamental piece of how they've created so much value for so long. This company is over 150 years old. It's, I think, over $40 billion company now. It has worked for them for a long time, and it continues to work. So one of the questions that we wanted to ask, well, why does that work so well? What is it about this distribution or the product itself, or what is it that makes that model work? And we want to understand that so we could understand what might make that model not work in the future. Right? So we kind of start with how things work now and really understanding how we create value. One of the fundamental insights that came out of that work is the fact that paint is really heavy and it's really difficult to transport. There's all sorts of hazmat rules and they vary by state in some localities, and you can only move them in certain types of equipment. So the logistical aspect of distributing Sherwin-Williams product is pretty highly regulated and pretty complicated. And difficult to accomplish without that vertical integration, without a company-owned fleet of trucks and brick and mortar stores and those sorts of things. So once we understood that, that gives us a really core insight to look for things that could change that fundamental premise of how Sherwin creates value. If there is a development out there in the world that would change the notion that paint is heavy and difficult to move around, that's something Sherwin would want to be paying attention to. And I can assure you that they very much are, because that would change a lot of the calculus around how their business model has worked for a long time. And that's what we mean by true disruption and what we're trying to avoid. So I hope that was useful. I think we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm happy to answer any questions. If anybody's interested in the slides, I'd be happy to share those too. Just let us know in the chat. And my colleague Misty here is going to help me with the Q&A. We'll see if we have any questions. Misty, do we have anything in the Q&A?
No questions yet.
Okay, great. Well, let me just say thank you very much for joining us today. I hope this was you found this a good use of your time. Again, just sort of scratching the surface on some of these topics, but the key takeaway I think really is there is a way, there are ways to see disruption coming. And there are playbooks that you can employ once you've identified what's happening or likely to happen in your industry. But you need to do some work. You need to go to med school to understand how disruption really works, understand what patterns we're looking for, and understanding what data can give us insights about about those patterns and what we're seeing happen in the industry. So with that, Misty, unless there's any other questions, we can probably go ahead and wrap up.
No questions.
All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.